Back to be my guest. Joining me on the line right now is Dr. David Reiss, and we've had David on before, trying to help us understand things that maybe from a psychological perspective. And David is based out of San Diego, but he also has offices he's also licensed in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and North Dakota. He's an expert in borderline disorders. He's worked with in sports-related industries. And David, as we were talking about off air, you emailed me the other day shortly after this happened, or when the words started to filter out about it, and I was thinking right away about you, because when things like this happen, people are trying to find answers, explanations. They're reaching out for the whys and the wherefores, and maybe you can just help me to, or not me, but just help to explain, from your background and your areas of expertise, when something like this happens, and certainly when it happens in sports, how do you come to sort of grips with it, or how do you try to understand the whole thing?
Yeah, obviously it's very difficult, and we don't know enough about this person to know exactly what was happening. But the first response is to try to understand. The problem is sometimes there's no good way to understand. We can understand the general stresses people are under, and as more information comes out, we may find out more specifics as to what may have triggered this horrible event. But the reality is we try to understand, we try to figure out whether to grieve or to be angry or both, and there's really no good immediate answer other than that everybody is in pain about what happened.
And I think this whole thing happened in a very unusual way. The gentleman, Jovan Belcher, shot his girlfriend with whom they had a child. I believe he shot her like 9 times. He did it right in front of his mother, and then he drives off to the Kansas City Chiefs practice facility. He addresses the coach and the general manager, thanks them for all that they've done for him, and then proceeds to kill himself with a gun. And this happens on, the day before the game. So there's a whole bunch of moving parts that are happening here, and the team basically decides, after polling the players, to go ahead and play the game. Now, as I understand it, the NFL gave them the option of canceling the game if they wanted to. Romeo Crennel, who is the coach of the team, basically decided that they should play the game because they're football players. That's what they do. And it was their own way of dealing with the situation. In your opinion, I'm getting maybe a little off topic here, but how was the whole thing played out in terms of the relevant people involved in the whole situation?
I think that's a very good point. And I did see the interview with him after the game where he made that quote, "We're football players, this is what we do." And there are two sides to that. On one hand, there is a point that this may be the best mechanism some of these people have for dealing with it, because it's something that's so difficult to deal with. On the other hand, there's some aspect of pushing it under the rug, of sort of papering it over and making a public display of grief while perhaps avoiding the intensity of the personal pain and conflict, which I'm not that I blame anyone. It's just saying that that's an automatic response that most of us would have that isn't necessarily healthy. There are a lot of very, to use the word nice doesn't really fit, but expressions of grief and mourning and all of that, which makes sense, but really hides the horror of what happens. And at times can get in the way of people really coming to terms with just how horrible it is, and that it really is a call for some kind of action to try to at least reduce the odds of this ever happening again.
And again, we're talking about the horror. If we only look at it from the point of view, let's look at Romeo Crennel. He's the head coach of a team that is struggling. A player who I think apparently they had been trying to reach out to decides to kill himself, and he does it right in front of you. And I mean, this is a coach. His job on that team is to basically come together with a game plan that everyone around him, his assistants, his players, everybody will buy into. Now, he's been exposed to something that in his lifetime, he probably could never, ever imagine. And maybe he has had something remotely connected to that, but, it happened right in front of him. Now he has to basically come to grips with that. He has to sort of get his team together in addition to putting together a game plan, coming to the decision, well, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to play the game or not? It seems to me that there's a lot of things that were happening with him specifically, and we're talking about this team has not played very well. His future with the team can't even be that secure because he's had a losing season. So where would Romeo Crennel fit in this whole thing in terms of, like, what do we make of him and his leadership under a very, very trying circumstance that had nothing to do with football?
Right. I mean, I think, obviously I don't know the man personally. From all appearances, he did as well as can be expected. But from my point of view, he was the last person who should have been given the responsibility to make the decision. Someone who's experienced that kind of trauma, there's no way they can think it through logically and really take into account, in a case like this, themselves, their players, their families, the fans. This is national television, international. To put that added responsibility on him when he's basically in emotional shock, in a sense, was the worst thing to do. I don't believe he's the one who should have made the decision. Whether or not it was the right decision, you can argue, but surely for his own sake, he shouldn't have been the one given the responsibility to make the decision.
So that would point to, just as we continue this line of thought, should it have been the NFL? Should it have been the owner? Who specifically, or a combination of the two, should have made the decision?
I would say whatever at the highest level of administration, with medical and psychiatric input, and not only in regards to the players, but in regards to the fans, and really having someone there who has some expertise and who could put things in a perspective that would be impossible for the people who were in personal shock.
And I think I'll give credit to whoever it was that decided to have the moment of silence before the game for victims of domestic violence, domestic abuse, because there's no way in the world that you can have a moment of silence for the player, and you just can't have a moment of silence. But to specifically point it to domestic violence, I thought to me was an appropriate way, if even there is somewhat of an appropriate way. Given what you're talking about is maybe the game should not have even been played. Somebody higher above should have made that decision. But at least to make that type of decision before the start of the game, I think to me showed some common sense, some practicality under a very abnormal situation.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, because to have done a moment of silence for him or for his girlfriend has, in some ways, that would be considered appropriate. In a sense, it was too early, the emotions are too raw, and there are too many conflicted feelings for that to have any real meaning. Whereas if somewhere there was a message that this is a bigger problem and a devastating problem for many families, tragically, that was probably the best way to handle it.
This incident here, there are a lot of incidents, in Canada, the rules about guns are considerably different than they are in the United States. One of the first rights is the right to bear arms. The situation here, people die a lot because of violence due to guns. And yet here it's brought to a national spotlight because, it happened in the height of the NFL season, the day before a game. Is there anything at all that can be learned from something like this?
There is, but will the right people learn it is doubtful. Obviously, people who are in trouble should not have access to guns, but it's very hard to identify those people at times. And, the society has to make a choice of what risks they take. From a psychiatric point of view, the first thing you do when you're dealing with someone who's in any kind of distress is ask them if they have access to weapons, and if they do, get rid of them, or at very least, put them in a place where they don't have easy access to them, where they can't, act impulsively. And of course, if there's no access at all, it's not impossible to be violent, but it's much easier to be impulsive through the relatively impersonal manner of using a gun than any other form of violence. So the reality is it does make situations like this more likely and more dangerous and more fatal.
Should basically, now that something like this has happened, does the NFL have to change its protocols in terms of either dealing with players and help that they may need, teams, and how to address something that is so uncharacteristically out of the realm of just day-to-day, dealings with football? Because this was one of them, right? You're
right.
Do teams and I don't know how much further you can go. Like the society need to have. Well, let's basically draw it back to the NFL. Do they need to put in some kind of protocols now that it's happened that can help them deal with this going forward, and maybe even something as simple as, like you said before, if something like this happens, take it out of the hands of the head coach and put somebody in a higher authority that makes the decision for them.
Right. I think that would be helpful, that if there's concern that someone is in trouble, get some professional advice. Even if the person isn't willing to go themselves, at least let the staff get some professional advice and not just deal with it on their own. I mean, we don't know the specific situation, but there might be signals that someone who isn't trained could miss, that saying that a situation is or is not dangerous. So I think there should be more professional consultation. But it really goes back beyond the NFL. It goes back to changing the culture from Pee Wee football and other sports onward, because so many of these athletes, especially those who are good at what they do, will get protected, will not be allowed to have what's really a normal development, and never really develop a sense of responsibility or how to manage anger. And then they're encouraged to act out the anger on the field in a whole different way, where at times the boundaries just get lost. So it really needs to start from the earliest levels with the culture and then move on to, you can't make the NFL responsible to psychiatrically evaluate every player, but at least to be aware of the warning signs and do more than just have a coach talk to someone. Now, I don't know exactly what happened in this situation, but certainly more psychiatric and neurological input is necessary, because we have the whole question of how much does head injury and subtle head injury contribute to impulsivity. So really having psychiatrists and neurologists on top of the situation whenever there's concern might reduce the risk.
Dr. Reiss, it's always a pleasure talking to you, because, again, you're able to help us to understand sports in a way that's just so far different from just seeing it from a game or a business. It's
right. And seeing it from a business surely gets in the way at times of seeing it as people.
Yeah, that's really what it is. Your website is dmrdynamics.com.
Correct.
And
I do have on the website right now some information in general about the whole issue of violence in sports for anyone who's interested.
Then I would recommend anybody go to the website dmrdynamics.com just to learn more about Dr. Reiss and the good things that he does. Thanks as always for spending some time with us to help us deal with what a lot of people are really having a difficult time understanding and going forward with.
Thank you, Perry. It's always my pleasure, unfortunately under uncomfortable circumstances today.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.